My name is Max for this. My name is Mark, actually, and I run a YouTube channel called Robespierre where I talk about British politics and Brexit in particular. Used to talk mainly about Brexit, but I also talk about British politics in general now because unfortunately the argument has, or the discussion has moved away from Brexit, but I think it's going to come back at some stage. So I'm going to speak a bit about Brexit tonight. I'm going to cover things that you've probably already heard so many times before, but I think it's important to also to go back to what happened in 2016 and what led up to that and what has happened since then. So just a bit of an introduction myself. I started the YouTube channel probably 2017, 2018. So I remember when Brexit happened. I was sitting in my car at a traffic light and I heard on the radio here in Italy. So I'm in Italy, but I heard on the radio that the vote had come in and the UK had voted to leave the European Union. And I was shocked because I had a feeling that it could go either way to, a few days before, and then when the vote came in, I was shocked and I thought, okay, everything is going to change now. And then after we also had, for example, Donald Trump getting elected, so that was another sign of things are going in a particular direction. So when I started the channel, it the only person I saw talking about Brexit from the other side was James O'Brien, and James O'Brien from LBC, because all of the discussion had been about pro-Brexit rhetoric. It had been all about promoting the UK leaving the European Union. And then you had Farage on LBC and on ITV, on the BBC, constantly on TV, talking about how no, the UK needed to leave. It would fix all of the problems. People couldn't access the NHS. They couldn't get a doctor's appointment. They couldn't get any of these things. Everything was bad, and the reason for it was the European Union. And the only way to solve those problems, of course, was to leave. So I started responding to this on with my YouTube channel. I would take clips of James O'Brien talking and add some commentary of my own, and then the channel sort of exploded as a result of that. And it's at about 225,000 subscribers now. It was one of the biggest ones, but since I think after COVID, a lot of people jumped on YouTube, and there are a lot of bigger channels than mine on there. But myself and a few other people are really the only ones who are not constantly, but reminding people about the consequences of Brexit and bringing up the issues related to Brexit. So what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about the why Brexit happened, the process within British politics, the economic impact, Northern Ireland and the Union, and then where we are today. So if we go back to 2016, what were some of the driving forces behind the Leave vote? So you had Vote Leave and you had Leave.eu, and one of them was run mainly by Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, and the other was, of course, Nigel Farage. So we tend to forget about that. We tend to believe that the Leave vote was one unique bloc, but in reality, it was divided into two different groups. You had the sovereignty movement, the taking back control people, and then you also had the ones who were selling the idea that immigration was the problem, and immigration needed, it sounds very similar to today, of course, but immigration was the problem, and the only way to solve it was leaving the European Union and ending freedom of movement. Now, as we saw, Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage, charismatic figures, whether you like them or not, you can't deny that. And they were able to convince people that every problem that they had stemmed from the European Union. And then on the other side, we of course had the Remainer movements, and most of these were led, or the Remain movement itself led by David Cameron. And when people were, of course, voting in the referendum, they were not happy about the status quo. They were not happy about the current situation, and this allowed the likes of Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage to tap into a lot of distrust in politics and distrust in the establishment. And of course, David Cameron represented the establishment, and the people around him, Tony Blair and others who were supporting remaining in the European Union, were selling the idea. And this is a critique I have of that section of the Remain community, or the Remain groups was that they were not selling a pro-European message. They were selling a Remain message. They were not talking about the positives of the European Union. They were engaging in a in a sort of project fear. I don't like to use this term, but that was the term used back in 2016 by the other side. But they were engaging in a type of selling the idea that, leaving the European Union would be bad, but they were not talking about the positives. Now, this, of course, was jumped on by the Brexit parties, the Brexit groups, I should say, and they were able to latch on to that mistrust of politicians and the establishment. And of course, austerity and economic frustration in left behind areas encouraged people to vote against the establishment, what they saw as the establishment. And I have said this before on my own channel, how Brexit was somewhat leaving in order to take back control, leaving in order to reduce immigration, but also leaving in order to give the establishment, as people saw it, a bloody nose. And we saw the highest vote to leave in the most deprived areas, ironically, paradoxically. Communities that received more money from the European Union through structural funds and support from the European Union were some of the areas that voted mostly to leave the European Union, like parts of Wales and, of course, Clacton, where Nigel Farage is I almost said Prime Minister, is an MP today. So these areas were convinced that their situation, they've been left behind by the establishment, and at the same time, the establishment is trying to convince them, no, you need to remain in the European Union. So there are a number of factors, of course, that were working against the Remain campaign. And people were tired with the political establishment. They were tired of the situation that they had been put in as a result of austerity and other factors, and they wanted change. And they saw this as change. Now, of course, the day of the vote came in. One of the first things people were searching on on Google was, what is the European Union? And so I just opened the chat, so if some of your questions come in there. There was the top search on Google was, what is the European Union? So people were voting for something that they didn't understand. And I had said at the time as well that it should not have been a referendum. It should have been a vote in Parliament, because the politicians were asking people to vote on something they clearly didn't understand. And of course, a referendum of this type should have had an independent body set up to provide transparent and clear information to the public, to inform them on what they were voting for or voting against, like in Switzerland or other countries which use referenda as a political system, as part of their political system. So Brexit happened. Then we moved into, of course, the chaos following the vote, because many people when they voted for Brexit, thought that was it, done and dusted, that the vote came in, the UK was getting ready to leave the European Union. And then, as we know, it was not a simple leaving process. We had the resignation of David Cameron. Then we had, of course, Theresa May come in as the next Prime Minister and leader of the Conservative Party, and she began the negotiations with the European Union and suffered a number of defeats where she tried to push things through Parliament and received a significant number of votes against that. When it came to Theresa May's negotiations, she started out, I believe, approaching it in a professional way. She realized, okay, the vote has come in. We need to respect the vote, but we need to negotiate a good deal, a good exit with the European Union. But unfortunately, that all sort of went very south when it became clear that the Brexiteers, or the Brexit supporters in her party, were not happy with the type of negotiations that were taking place. And they wanted somebody who believed in Brexit to be at the negotiating table. So we saw a back and forth between members of the Conservative Party pressuring Theresa May to negotiate a more Brexit-style deal, something that would, Brexit means Brexit. She realized that she needed to embrace the ERG and the right of her party in order to hold on to power. And then, of course, that quickly slipped away, and we ended up with a Boris Johnson government. So Boris Johnson, of course, jumped in believing that he would be the man who would be able to deliver Brexit. And then he realized pretty quickly that it was not an easy thing to do. So we ended up with our the backstop and the Northern Ireland Protocol, and sorry, the backstop and Northern Ireland, which led to the Get Brexit Done, the withdrawal agreement that Boris Johnson eventually sold to the public and helped him win the 2019 general election and saw off the Labour Party led by Jeremy Corbyn. So with the Get Brexit Done, it was a winning slogan. People were tired of Brexit at that stage. You have to remember, people had been talking about this from 2016 until 2019, and many people were tired. The public wanted to move on from this. Now, you can sort of understand the frustrations the voters had. They wanted the public to focus more on the NHS or the cost of living or education, or infrastructure, jobs, these things. And Boris Johnson was able to sell this to the public under Get Brexit Done, a winning slogan. He was helped to formulate this, of course, by his friend Dominic Cummings. So Boris Johnson wins power. He's able to get his Brexit done. And this led to, of course, the consequences of Brexit. Now, we can also trace some of the consequences back to before the UK left the European Union. So it left in 2021 or the end of 2020, but it remained within the European Union during the transition period of 2020. So we had both the pandemic and the UK leaving the European Union eventually. Now, there was a bit of a back and forth between the UK and the EU in this period. We had negotiating taking place. So the UK had officially left, but it was still within the transition period. And the European Union has said to the UK government under Boris Johnson, there is the pandemic, we need to focus on this. And if you want, we can postpone the trade negotiations until the pandemic has been resolved. But Boris Johnson refused to do that. And of course, he went full steam ahead with his TCA, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So what was the impact economically? And we get a lot of figures bandied about, but we can see, I would prefer to focus more on what we know. So we know that there has, as a result of leaving the single market and the customs union, there has been an economic impact. It has increased friction on trade between the UK and the European Union. But it has also created labour shortages in key sectors. We saw the farming sector struggling to get the workers that they needed at the beginning of Brexit. We heard stories about turkey farmers not being able to provide turkeys for Christmas because they couldn't find the workers they needed. And this was as a result of the ending of freedom of movement. So while it was quite simple, quite easy for people to come from mainly Eastern Europe to work in different sectors of the UK economy when the UK was a member of the European Union. And of course, in many cases, they would come for a short period of time, a few months or a few years, and they would return back to their home country, perhaps bringing money with them in order to return to work there or to start a life there, to buy a house or to start a family back in their home country. As a result of the ending of freedom of movement, what have we seen? We've seen greater immigration, ironically, once again, this was one of the arguments for leaving the European Union. We saw a dramatic increase in immigration from outside the European Union. And unlike European migrants, these people from outside would bring their families with them, or they would stay a longer period of time. They would set down roots in the UK, something that is, of course, creating a lot of conflict at the moment. So Brexit has had an impact on GDP. We're talking about at least 4%. It has created a massive problem when it comes to investment, something that the UK has struggled to attract, not just because of Brexit, but over the last number of decades. So there's been a very little investment into the UK. And then Brexit, of course, added extra problems to that. And this has impacted small businesses. Now, we tend to hear about small businesses that import and export, but we have to remember that even if you don't import or export, you're probably relying on somebody who does. And they are definitely being impacted by Brexit. Now, there have been some regions which have fared better and some regions which have fared worse. But when it comes, for example, to London or the City of London, they have probably come out the best. The exception, of course, being Northern Ireland. Why? Well, because Northern Ireland is part of the single market when it comes to goods. So Northern Ireland is in a unique position to take advantage of being part of the single market so it can sell goods into the Republic of Ireland without any problems. And it can and it's also part of the UK internal market, so it's able to trade with GB. Now, that has not all been uh, plain sailing because we have seen the consequences of Northern Ireland being part of the single market and GB being not. So this means that there are checks, or there were checks on goods coming in from GB into Northern Ireland. And this resulted in conflicts within Northern Ireland's unionist community and their demands for the Northern Ireland Protocol, which was part of Boris Johnson's oven ready deal, the withdrawal agreement, to be changed. So, following pressure from unionist politicians in GB and unionist politicians in Northern Ireland, they eventually came up with the Windsor Framework, which was a compromise so that goods coming from GB into Northern Ireland, if they're to stay in Northern Ireland, they would not be checked. Only goods that were destined to leave Northern Ireland, for example, to the Republic or the rest of the EU, they would have to be checked. So this was a bit of a compromise, but the unionist community in Northern Ireland were still not satisfied. And I think this is going to create problems for the unionist community in Northern Ireland, but also in Scotland. So in Scotland, they, of course, voted to remain in the European Union in 2016. And the SNP and other political parties in Scotland, with the exception of the Unionists, the Conservatives, have been very critical of Brexit. It's also interesting because even the Conservatives in Scotland in 2016 were not supportive of Brexit. I'm not sure if I don't remember if they were explicitly coming out against Brexit, but they were certainly of the idea that the UK should remain. And they understood, at least they understood, that Brexit would be problematic also for Scotland, and it would create a wedge between Westminster and Edinburgh. So when it comes to Northern Ireland, it means that it's going to create problems going forward, and it's going to put more pressure on the unionist community to understand that maybe their future is not part of the UK, but part of a united Ireland. And maybe we can talk a little bit about that more after the talk. And then finally, I just want to come to where we stand today. So what is the current situation with Brexit? So when Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, Liz Truss for 5 minutes, and Rishi Sunak were prime ministers, their approach to Europe was generally aggressive, generally antagonistic. But we have seen since the Labour Party have taken over that the approach to Europe has been somewhat better. Now, it's important also to remember that while Keir Starmer has been critical of the Brexit deal, his party is lukewarm to criticising Brexit itself. You will find Labour MPs who are critical of Brexit, but the party itself is critical of the deal, which is the one that Boris Johnson signed with the European Union, not Brexit itself. So I think if you are speaking to Labour MPs or members of the Labour Party, it's important to point out that difference. So is there a possibility for closer alignment? Yes, I think issues like the war in Ukraine has pushed Europe and the UK together. Both understand that they need to work together when it comes to dealing with the threat from Russia. Public opinion, of course, has trended away from support for Brexit. Even when after the vote had come in, we saw a dramatic drop in support for Brexit. And then when the UK left, and then since then, the support for remaining in the European, or to rejoin the European Union, is increasing. But I think it's also important that while public opinion has shifted on Brexit in the sense that they want more and more people want the UK to be part of the European Union, the politicians are still lagging. So the politicians are still hoping that the public will not focus too much on this. And this is why I think we have a responsibility to keep raising this issue. So what are the possibilities of rejoining the European Union? I think we tend to focus a lot on the UK joining and not so much on the European Union welcoming Britain. So I think the European Union at the moment is holding back. They're hoping that well, there will be this, the issue will be settled within the UK, and then we can move to a stage where uh, a stable UK government that's pro-European will approach the European Union and say, yes, we want to join. So I think we're going to have to wait for a period of time for the likes of Nigel Farage to and his party to pass by, and we end up having some sort of consensus within Parliament that support the idea of rejoining the European Union. So the people are on board, but the politicians are still somewhat behind.